35 years ago, professional basketball came to North Carolina and Greensboro. The Carolina Cougars invaded the land of the ACC and college basketball with its run-and-gun style and colorful ball. Tonight, on this WFMY News 2 Sports Special, we'll look back at the 5-year run of the Cougars in the Piedmont. Here's Greg Kerr with the story of the Carolina Cougars.
For 5 years, pro basketball was played in Greensboro, and WFMY news cameras covered those games. You'll see original film footage that has not been seen since airing on Channel 2 News over 30 years ago. The American Basketball Association, with its trademark red, white, blue basketball, began play in 1967, but hardly as a rival to the more established NBA. After 2 years in Houston as the Mavericks, where ABA legend has it, 89 fans once watched a Maverick game. The franchise was sold and moved to basketball-crazy North Carolina. And so began the 5-year, 3-city, 4-arena odyssey of the Carolina Cougars. The franchise was based on a regional concept. The idea, interestingly enough, came from a Sports Illustrated article in 1968. Back then, North Carolina didn't have a major metropolitan area, so the team played in Charlotte, Raleigh, and Greensboro. In July of 1969, rookie Gene Little showed off the team's uniforms. No big press conference, just Littles, a gym, and a camera. Back then, it was less about the show than it is now.
Basketball had arrived, but it wasn't, nobody knew exactly what it was. You know, the NBA was established, the ABA was this upstart league. There were a lot of players that people had never heard of, and we found out that the franchise was moving here from Houston. So it was a matter of curiosity as much as anything else.
Ownership also wanted a Carolina connection with its players. Then ABA Commissioner George Mikan wasn't too sure about the obvious ploy to go local with talent.
This is the big question. How many local boys can you put together to make it a winning combination? The professional ownership owes the area an obligation to show them the finest talent available.
The Cougars didn't have to go far to find a head coach. ACC legend Bones McKinney accepted the Cougars' job. Bones had retired from coaching, but the former pro player took to the idea of coaching at the pro level.
You know, you don't always win on ability. I think we go back to some of the things that are said in college, and these things are really true. You win on character a lot of times. And these fellows have given me more effort than I ever anticipated.
Bill Haas covered the Cougars for the city's newspapers. Haas was in the Cougar locker room from day one until the end in 1974.
And as it turned out, it was a lot better than people expected. This was being in the heart of college basketball territory. Fans were a little slow to warm up to it.
In that first season, true to the plan, the Cougars did go with players fans could identify with. Former ACC guys like former Duke Blue Devil Bob Burga, Clemson's Randy Mahaffey, and former Tar Heel Doug Moe.
I think we're going to have a real good team. I think we got a chance to end up there pretty high.
The Cougars surprised the league, going 42-42 and making the playoffs. At the same time, the club built a solid fan base in Greensboro. Jerry Steele was an assistant coach that first season, and playing regionally certainly had its moments.
We're 0-7, playing in Dorton Arena in Raleigh. The circus has just moved out. They left some things behind. There was probably thousands of flies. Not many people stayed for the end of it.
Year number 2, 1970-71, new ownership was willing to spend money for better talent. To prove it, the Cougars drafted the legendary Pete Maravich, but Pistol Pete opted instead to bank the millions offered by the NBA's Atlanta Hawks. Bones McKinney, after a 17-25 start, was fired. Steele, who'd been with McKinney from the start, took the team over.
We hope we win some games, but to get back to what it would take, the short period of time that I've seen it, it appears to me that the clubs that get 5 people back on defense have a chance of being competitive.
The taste was bad, but, you know, sometimes, at least it was a taste. But then travel was brutal. You know, everything was commercial flights. You go out, you get the early flight. You know, you're playing, the schedule was abnormal. Some people travel well, some don't. I didn't.
33 years later, Steele looks back on his time with the Cougars with mixed emotions. After 2 seasons dealing with a pro game, Steele went back to college and spent the next 31 years at High Point before retiring after the 2003 season. In 1971-72, the Cougars had a new look, going green and blue, but Carolina struggled on the floor. Highlights that year, an exhibition with the NBA Baltimore Bullets and former Winston-Salem State Ram Earl the Pearl Monroe. The NBA Bullets beat the Cougars 106-104. Later that season, former Tar Heel Larry Miller lit up the Memphis Pros at the Coliseum, scoring an ABA high at the time, 67 points.
That was a game that I'll always remember. It's one of those, it just came up out of nowhere. It wasn't like Julius Erving scoring 67 points or Dan Issel. It was Larry Miller.
A Cougar ticket was a couple of bucks, well worth the admission to see an ABA exclusive, cheerleaders. You didn't get that kind of entertainment in the NBA. Also, a few future Hall of Famers came to town. A young doctor, Julius Erving, made Greensboro house calls with the Virginia Squires and New York Nets. Fans also saw one of the all-time great forwards, Hall of Famer Rick Barry. The Cougars become one of the ABA's elite when the Carolina Cougars story continues after this. Red, white, and blue memories, professional basketball in Greensboro, the Carolina Cougar story.
And frankly, they would like some of our ownership because we have been forceful, we've been strong, we seem to have direction. If we maintain it, we're going to be hell. We're going to be something else.
By this time, the ABA was challenging the NBA for players and respect. And one of the league's innovations was scoffed at by the NBA, the three-point shot. It was an ABA original, and the league would have the last laugh because the NBA would adopt the three-pointer 12 years later.
There were a lot of things that we did that at the time they thought were gimmicky, but it turned out that it changed the game. The three-point shot, of course, being the preeminent one, but it definitely changed the pro game and the college game.
Mike Lewis joined the Cougars in 1972, but he spent more time dealing with injuries than playing.
Of course, I'm a long ways from running. I can walk now and everything, but it's a long ways away. And
Mike retired after the 1974 season and never left the Piedmont. He hadn't been back in the old Guilford College gym where the Cougars practiced in 30 years. An All-American at Duke, Lewis was drafted by the ABA's Indiana Pacers. A two-time ABA All-Star, Lewis then moved on to Pittsburgh and finally Carolina. The ABA was an experience, especially a stop in Pittsburgh where paydays weren't always paydays.
One time we got paid about half the checks bounced. So the next time that payday rolled around, all 12 guys were in there beating up on the secretary trying to get their check, and we all had a 100-yard dash across Fifth Avenue in Pittsburgh to Pittsburgh National Bank to see who could get their check cashed, because if you got it first, got your cash, you had a halfway chance of getting some money for that month.
1972-73, a Cougar investment paid off. $30,000 a season for the team's fourth head coach, ABA vet and former Tar Heel Larry Brown.
You know, I think we're capable of making our presence felt. It's just a matter of us getting it all together and playing well.
Brown brought along former Coug Doug Moe to be his assistant. The Cougars would win a league-high 57 games.
Larry Brown and Doug Moe went on to win hundreds of games in the NBA after the fact, so even though it was their first real head coaching job, they were great.
Arizona State, 6'5", number 27, Captain Joe Caldwell.
Former NBA player Joe Caldwell was in his second season with the Cougars. Newly acquired Matt Calvin was one of the ABA's top guards. But it was NBA defector Billy Cunningham who made the biggest impression. Billy C. was lured away from the NBA's Philadelphia 76ers, and Cunningham owned the league in '73. Brown was voted the ABA Coach of the Year, Cunningham the league's most valuable player. But the Cougars lost in the ABA semifinals. 1973-74 would be the Cougars' final season in Carolina. Cunningham had health problems and only played 32 games, and the team was being torn apart by a few unhappy players. On top of that, rumors of the team being sold and moved caused more problems.
Well, we hope it don't affect us at all. I think that most of the guys is kind of like resting up for the playoffs, and I think they're getting in their mind that they got to play the game because there's no tomorrow in this thing.
It's like anything else. It would be like a job if you were a salesperson somewhere and your company was rumored to be sold or something like that. You just have the same feelings. It was not comfortable.
Through it all, the Cougars made the playoffs but were eliminated by the Kentucky Colonels in 4 games. Shortly after the season, Ted Munchak pulled the plug and the franchise was sold and moved to St. Louis. The 5-year odyssey of the Carolina Cougars had come to an end. 4 head coaches and 83 players later.
The Cougars, that was an excellent organization from top on down. The owner was a sound business person. Carl Scheer was an excellent general manager, and it wasn't something that was thrown together. It was a professional team.
If the Cougars could have hung on one more year, drafted David Thompson, and signed him, they could have filled up the Coliseum on a nightly basis, and I think they could probably would have been included in the ABA-NBA merger. But of course, hindsight's always 20/20.
Some 30 years later, where are some of the Cougars now? Bob Berga, the team's top scorer in the first season, is a tennis pro in New Jersey. Joe Caldwell, at last check, was living in Arizona. On a recommendation by his college coach, Dean Smith, Larry Brown was the Cougars' 4th coach. Brown still coaches now for the NBA's Detroit Pistons. Billy Cunningham was the Cougars' bona fide star. He is now in basketball's Hall of Fame. And Gene Little, signed by the Cougars out of High Point College, was the last of the original Cougars. He's now an NBA scout living in Phoenix. The ABA lasted 9 years. Much of its history now survives by word of mouth. After leaving Carolina, the Cougars moved to St. Louis and lasted 2 more years before falling victim to the merger. All that's left of the Cougars' days in Carolina are distant memories on fading film, reminding us of professional basketball in Greensboro many, many years ago.